Today, the focus is memory moment. During class today, seventh grade, we are going to be focusing on a reading strategy titled Memory Moment. Typically, every author will interrupt the action of a story and share a memory. And when the author interrupts the action of a story and shares a memory, you have to stop and ask yourself, why might this memory be important? And so this can be when a character suddenly starts remembering something, even right in the middle of an important event, or maybe it's a quiet moment when the character thinks back on something from his or her past. I know this happens in real life. Many times we have those moments where it's almost like a deja vu moment where we remember back to, oh my gosh, I feel like this reminds me of. And that's exactly what this is for authors and author craft, where they interrupt the action of the story and you have to stop and ask yourself, why might this memory be important? So we're going to be looking at the short story, not the short story, but the text Grenade by Alan Gratz, because there are moments where Ray is in the middle of war in Okinawa and he stops and remembers his time back in Nebraska. And the same with Hideki. He has moments where he stops and thinks about life much earlier. And we have to stop and ask ourselves, why might these memories be important? So this particular moment took place with Ray. And throughout the text, Ray has been hinting at this long scar on his arm. And he hasn't really shared how he got the scar. He hasn't shared why he got the scar, but there's history behind this scar. So this is the moment where Ray is sharing. He interrupts the action of the story. He interrupts the moment that he's experiencing in war and thinks back to the moment when the injury happened. Ray touched the long scar on the inside of his left arm and remembered how he'd gotten it. Ray had been shooting a rifle since he was 6, and every winter it was his job to shoot the hogs before he and his father hung them up to butcher them. It had been the same every year until he was 11 years old. That year, Ray's father had stood to the side with his butcher knife, like always, waiting for Ray to put down one of the pigs. But that year, everything went wrong. Usually, one .22 rifle slug was enough to kill a pig, but this pig didn't die with one shot. It took the bullet and squealed, staggered away. The high-pitched screeching was the most awful thing Ray had ever heard, and he immediately felt sick. He hadn't meant for the pig to suffer. Ray hurried to take aim with his rifle again to put the poor thing out of its misery, and that's when his father had gone crazy. "No!" Ray's father screamed. "Stay away from him! Get away!" And suddenly he ran at Ray with the butcher knife. Ray got the rifle up just in time to block the first of his father's slashes. But the next one caught Ray on the inside of his left arm, carving a deep gash from his wrist almost all the way down to his elbow. Ray screamed and dropped the rifle. He ducked his father's next attack and ran for the house, clutching his arm to his chest. His mother drove him to the hospital for stitches, and when they got back, his father wouldn't look him in the eye. But Pa had never apologized, never tried to explain, and none of them had spoken a word about what happened ever again. As many times as Ray had replayed that day in his head, he had still never understood exactly what it was that had set his father off. Was it the gunshot? The pig squealing? Ray chasing it down? Like all the other times his father had gotten violent and unpredictable, there was no understandable reason for it. But that time had been the worst. That time, It had cost Ray 2 pints of blood and the last bit of love he'd had for his father. This moment, Ray is on the island of Okinawa. He's in the middle of warfare, and he stops and remembers this moment where his father slashed him with a knife, and that's where the injury on his left arm came from. So, as a reader, the author interrupted the action of the story, and it's our job to ask, why might this memory be important? So, the text is Grenade, and it's by Alan Gratz, and I summarized the memory moment. I didn't quote it. The memory moment is from page 98, and it's when Ray is helping his father slaughter pigs. One pig died a slow death, squealing and screeching. Ray's father began to slash wildly with his butcher knife and cut a deep gash from Ray's wrist to elbow. Ray saw a doctor and was bandaged up. However, Ray's father never apologized or spoke of the incident. So the big question is, why is this memory important? Well, one thing I do know is that Ray's father didn't want him to go fight in World War II. And this might explain, this incident might explain a lot, because this memory is important because it shows one reason why Ray's father did not want him to fight in the war. Ray's father was clearly suffering PTSD. On page 40, Ray remembers father telling him not to go fight in the war because Ray had a deferment from the government. However, Ray chose to go fight partly because of what happened to him when slaughtering pigs in Nebraska. I think this memory is important because it shows Ray wanted to get away from his dad, even if it involved participating in war. So his dad was not encouraging him to go fight in World War II, and this seems to explain a lot as to why. Whatever his dad, we know his dad fought in war, and this makes me realize that whatever PTSD experience he was having following the war was his reasoning why Ray shouldn't go to war. So now we're going to take a look at another moment in the text. This next moment is a moment where Hideki interrupts exactly what's happening in his present moment and stops to think about an earlier memory in his life, and it took place in the book Grenade on pages 32 through 34. So your job here is, I'll read it, but your job is to think about, why is this memory important for Hideki? How does this memory help you understand Hideki on a deeper level? Hideki sucked on a piece of kenpan, a tough dried biscuit. He hated to already eat what little food the army had given him, but he was hungry. And besides, the Imperial Japanese Army was going to drive the Americans from the island in a matter of days, weren't they? If everything went the way the IJA promised, the battle would be over soon. Then Hideki's mother and brother would come home from Japan, and his father and sister would come home from the front lines. The whole family would be together again. It had been almost 8 months since his mother and little brother Isamu went away, since Hideki too was supposed to go away. He still remembered that day as though he had a picture of it. The hot August sun, the narrow docks, the throngs of Okinawans pressing toward the big black passenger ships waiting to take them north to mainland Japan. Hideki's mother carried Isamu in her arms, and Isamu clutched his little papier-mâché lion dog. Hideki followed behind with his father and his older sister Kimiko. "You'll be safe in Japan." "Yes, much safer than on Okinawa," Hideki's father said, as though he was trying to convince himself too. Oto was short like Hideki, but stocky, with a mustache and a trim black beard. He stood next to Hideki's sister, who was already taller than both their mother and father. Kimiko was thin and elegant, with a white streak in her long black hair that had marked her since she was little as a Yuta, a person who could see and speak to the dead. Oto and Kimiko were there to say goodbye, not go with them. Oto had already been drafted into the IJA to fight, and Kimiko had been taken from her school and pressed into service as a nurse in an army hospital. Hideki hugged his sister and his father, his heart aching. His father had never been apart before. His family had never been apart before. He hated to leave them, but he hurried to join his mother and little brother so Kimiko and his father couldn't see his tears. He was almost on board the ship when someone grabbed him roughly by the arm. "Here, what's this?" demanded a scowling Japanese soldier. He held Hideki back. "Just where do you think you're going? How old are you?" 13, Hideki said, surprised. "Almost 14? 14 is old enough to fight," the soldier barked. Kimiko stepped between them. "You don't understand," she told the soldier. "Hideki's a scaredy cat. 350 years ago, one of our ancestors died like a coward, and now every third generation, the oldest boy is born afraid. This time around, it's Hideki. Until our ancestor's spirit finds peace, he's worthless in a fight." Hideki's face burned red with embarrassment, but everything his sister said was true. "Superstitious dojin," the soldier muttered, and Hideki heard his father gasp. Dojin was a rude way of saying primitive natives. The soldier was basically calling them animals. Hideki's fists tightened around the sack of clothes he carried. He was a coward, but it wasn't his fault. He was just born that way, and no amount of ceremonies and offerings to his ancestors had been able to free him from it. Maybe he thought it was time to try a more direct approach. Maybe it was time to override his ancestors' cowardice with his own bravery. Hideki stood tall. "I'm going to stay," he announced. His father and sister protested, but there was no time, and they couldn't make him go. His mother and little brother were swept up the ramp by the surging crowds, and Hideki waved goodbye to them. The Japanese soldier nodded his approval at Hideki and went to harass someone else. Kimiko smacked Hideki on the back of his head. "Idiot," she told him. Kimiko's rebuke echoed in Hideki's mind now as the shelling from the American battleships abruptly stopped. The silence was startling. There could only be one reason the Americans weren't shooting anymore. And so as a reader, Hideki is in the middle of battle, and he stops to think about the moment when he was supposed to get on the passenger ship to go travel to mainland Japan. And now, because he thinks back on the family curse, Shigetomo's curse, that he is a coward, and the IJA is angry and sharing with him that you're almost 14, you can fight. That why might this memory be important? Why at this point in time, when he's hearing the Americans and the gunshots and the sounds of war, why at this point in time does he stop and think about this moment when he had an opportunity to leave Okinawa and travel to mainland Japan? Why might this memory be important? That's your job today in class. Your job, this is posted in Google Classroom. Your job is to fill in why might this memory be important in full and complete sentences. You have a copy of this posted in Google Classroom, and this copy that you have access to is the student copy, where you'll be able to jot in that blank space. If for any reason you need to look back at the text, then the second slide has the link to the text, but your job is to fill in why might this memory that Hideki's having be important. How does it help you understand Hideki's character on a deeper level? And when you finish this, your job is to press the turn in button. Once you press the turn in button, your job is to transition into independent reading or working on the iReady dashboard, the iReady pathway, one or the other. The teacher in the classroom has information on who should be working on the iReady dashboard or the iReady pathway and working on independent reading. But if you don't know the information and you don't have a chance to ask the teacher, you can always go to our Google Classroom post, which tells you that the red and green group will be working on their iReady pathway. The brown and purple group will be working on their independent reading and reading response, because you do have a contrast and contradiction to finish. And the yellow group, you can choose. You can decide if you want to work on your iReady pathway or if you would prefer to work on independent reading and reading responses. And you'll work on that for about 25 minutes. Once you get directions from the teacher in the classroom, the last portion of class is going to be listening to the next 2 chapters in Grenade.